I was on my knees in my mother's hallway, screwdriver in hand, working on a loose air vent that had been rattling for 3 weeks. The old house groaned around me as I pried the metal cover free. Dust fell. A spider ran. I expected nothing remarkable. What I found changed my entire life. A thick brown envelope was taped to the inside wall of the duct. It was secured with wide tape, folded cleanly, placed there with obvious care by someone who did not want it found. My name was printed on the front in neat, dark letters. Not a nickname. My full legal name. My hands were already trembling when I tore the envelope open. Inside were formal legal documents. My late father's trust. There were property listings, investment accounts, and asset records. The numbers on those pages made my chest tighten. Millions of dollars, set aside specifically for me. I heard footsteps behind me. My mother stepped into the hallway. The moment she saw what I was holding, every drop of color left her face. She said nothing, just stood there, frozen. Then my wife came around the corner. She looked at the envelope in my hands. Then she looked at me. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. You weren't supposed to see that. My entire world cracked apart in that single moment. My name is Aaron Briggs. I am 47 years old, and I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. I spent my entire adult life believing my father left us nothing when he died. I built everything from the ground up, every dollar, every year, with my own 2 hands. Or so I believed. If this is your first time here, welcome. I share real stories that will shock you, shake you, and make you see the world differently. Please hit that subscribe button right now, so you never miss a single one. Now, let me take you back to where all of this truly started. My father died when I was 24 years old. My mother called me the morning after his passing and told me the news no one wants to hear. And then she told me something worse. The debts, she said, were enormous. Loans he had taken out, bills he had never managed to clear. She said he had left us with almost nothing, and that I should brace myself for a hard road ahead. I believed every word of it. She was my mother. She was grieving. She had no reason to deceive me. So I worked. I worked harder than most people I knew. I took on overtime whenever it was offered. I drove old cars and ate simple meals and told myself that this was just the life I had been given. My wife, Amy, and I built what we could together, or so I believed. But Amy's mother never let me forget what she thought of me. At family dinners, she made pointed comments about my income and my career. She said things like stable in a tone that turned it into an insult. She asked Amy, within earshot of me, whether she ever wished she had ended up with someone more ambitious. Amy always smiled and changed the subject. I always sat quietly and said nothing. Now I stared at documents proving my father had left me millions, and I felt physically sick. I did not let my mother take the envelope. When she reached for it in that hallway, I stepped back and held it firmly against my chest. She asked me to be calm. Amy suggested I take a breath before reading anything. I nodded at both of them and went upstairs. I spread the documents across the desk in the spare bedroom and read through every page. Twice, then a third time. The trust was legally drawn up under my father's name. The original documents were clear. I was the sole beneficiary. Everything was meant to transfer to me once probate closed. Then I found the amendment pages at the back of the envelope. These were additions made to the trust several years after my father passed. Significant changes. Changes that rerouted assets and delayed distributions without any clear legal explanation. I turned to the bottom of the first amendment page, and I saw a signature. My wife's handwriting. Amy's signature. Clear, deliberate, and unmistakable. I stared at it for a long time. My mind reached for innocent explanations. Maybe she had helped with routine paperwork as a simple favor. Maybe there was a misunderstanding I was not yet seeing. But a cold, heavy feeling had already settled deep in my chest. Something in me already knew the truth. I made a decision that night. I would not say anything. Not yet. I needed to be careful, because the moment I showed them what I had discovered, the situation would shift in ways I could not fully predict. So I folded the documents carefully, placed them back in the envelope, and tucked everything into the bottom of my laptop bag before going downstairs. That evening, Amy's mother came over for dinner. She was in a particularly sharp mood. She talked about a man she knew from church who had just purchased a vacation home. She asked me whether I had ever thought about aiming higher in my professional life. She smiled tightly when she said it. Amy sat next to her and looked at her plate. I smiled back. I poured the wine. I nodded at the right moments. Nothing in my face gave me away, because while I sat at that dinner table listening to comments about my lack of ambition, my mind was somewhere else entirely. Earlier that afternoon, I had stepped into the backyard and made a phone call. I had found the number for a well-respected state attorney in the city. I explained the basics of the situation quickly and carefully. She asked me to come to her office first thing the next morning with every document I had. I was already moving. The attorney's name was Paula Reeves. She was sharp, composed, and moved through information with precision that immediately made me trust her. I laid the entire envelope on her desk the next morning and watched her read through every page without a single change in her expression. When she finished, she set the papers down and folded her hands on the desk. What I was looking at, she said, was serious. The original trust had been properly drafted and legally executed under my father's name. I was clearly identified as a sole beneficiary. Everything was structured to transfer her to me once probate had closed. The amendments made after his death, however, were highly irregular. They lacked proper authorization. They had been inserted without my knowledge or consent. Then Paula pointed to a clause buried deep in the original trust agreement. It was a protection clause. If the executor of the estate committed any form of misconduct, including unauthorized amendments, improper transfers, or outright fraud, all transfers made during that period would be considered void. The full estate would revert back to the original trust structure and to me, and the executor could be held personally liable for every dollar lost during their period of control. My mother had been named executor of my father's estate. Paula looked at me steadily over the top of the documents. We have a case, she said. Paula brought in a forensic accountant named Walter within the week. He was a quiet man with careful eyes, and he had a habit of underlining things 3 times when he found them significant. When he came back to me with his first round of findings, nearly every page he handed over was covered in triple underlines. My childhood home had been sold after my father died. I had always known that. My mother told me she had sold it to clear debts. What I had not known was that it was sold at a price far below what it was worth. Walter calculated it at nearly 40% below market value, compared to similar homes sold in the area during the same period. And the buyer was not a regular family or a private investor. The property had been sold to a limited liability company, a shell company with a name that told you nothing about who actually owned it. Walter spent 3 days tracing that company through a series of paper filings. On the 4th day, he set a single printed page in front of me. The registered contact for the shell company was my mother. The secondary contact listed was Amy. This had not been a desperate decision made in a moment of panic. This had been organized, deliberately structured, planned over time. My father had built a small manufacturing business before he died. It was not large, but it was steady and well-run, and he had put 20 years of his life into it. When he passed, my mother told me the business had collapsed under the weight of unpaid debts. She said creditors had taken over everything. There was nothing left, she told me. I had never questioned it. Walter found the company still operating. It had not collapsed at all. It had not been taken by creditors. Shortly after probate closed, my father's company had been transferred through a series of internal transactions. My shares, the shares my father had set aside for me in the original trust, had been moved quietly into a family holding account that my mother controlled entirely. Over the 20 years that followed, the company had grown. New contracts, expanded operations, increased revenue. What had started as a modest operation was now worth several times its original value. I had spent those same 20 years working overtime and counting every dollar, while my inheritance sat inside a growing company that people I trusted had made sure I knew nothing about. Walter placed a business valuation in front of me and tapped the bottom line twice with his pen. I looked at the number. I did not say a word for a long time. Paula recommended I request the historical banking records tied to the state accounts. I went to the branch where my father had kept his accounts and submitted the formal request with all the supporting documentation Paula had prepared. The branch manager, a man named Phil, grew noticeably uncomfortable as he reviewed my paperwork. He excused himself twice to make phone calls in the back before returning and agreeing to pull the records. The documents arrived 4 days later. Walter went through them systematically. What he found confirmed everything we suspected and added more on top. Significant transfers had been made from the state accounts in the months immediately after probate closed. The amounts were substantial. The timing appeared deliberate, carefully positioned just after the standard window for legal oversight had passed. My mother had been the sole authorized account holder during that period. The transferred funds had moved into personal accounts registered in her name. I was driving home from Paula's office that evening when my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I glanced at it at a red light. A text from Amy. "You've been so quiet lately. Is something wrong? You seem like you're somewhere else." I set the phone back on the seat and stared at the road ahead. I kept driving. Walter arrived at his most serious discovery on a Tuesday morning. He came in quietly and placed a single folder on the table between us. He opened it to a page near the center and pointed to a section he had highlighted in yellow. My mother had used trust assets as collateral for a personal loan. She had taken funds that legally belonged to my father's estate, funds that were supposed to be preserved and eventually passed to me, and she had pledged them to a private lender in exchange for a loan she used for her own personal benefit. The loan was substantial. There was no documentation anywhere showing that she had received permission from anyone to do this. Paula told me what that meant in legal terms. An executor is bound by law to act entirely in the interest of the beneficiary. Using estate assets as personal loan collateral was the direct opposite of that obligation. It was a clear example of self-dealing. It was a serious breach of fiduciary duty. I walked into Paula's office later that afternoon, and she reviewed Walter's latest findings carefully. I noticed something shift in the way she carried herself. She sat straighter. Her tone changed. She had been cautious before. Now she was confident. Amy found me in the kitchen one evening while I was washing up after dinner. I had been careful for weeks, keeping my expression neutral, my daily routine unchanged, my conversations light and ordinary. But she had been watching me. She could feel that something had shifted, even if she could not name it. She put her hand on my arm and turned me gently toward her. She said she could tell something was wrong. She asked me to talk to her. I looked at her for a quiet moment. Then I asked, in the calmest voice I could find, why her name appeared on the amendment documents attached to my father's trust. She did not flinch. She answered smoothly and without hesitation, the way a person answers when they have thought about the question in advance. She said her mother had asked her to help with some estate paperwork years earlier. Routine filing, she said. She had not thought much of it at the time. I nodded slowly. I told her I appreciated her explaining it. Then I turned back to the dishes. She stood behind me for a moment, clearly waiting to see if I would push further. When I said nothing more, she left the kitchen. She still believed this was manageable. She did not yet understand what was coming. Paula filed a motion to reopen probate on a Thursday morning. The legal basis was straightforward. Newly discovered evidence of executor misconduct combined with unauthorized amendments to the original trust. The filing was comprehensive and well documented. Walter's forensic report was attached. The original trust with my father's stated intentions was attached. The amendment pages bearing Amy's signature were included as a separate exhibit. My mother received official notice the following Monday. She called me that afternoon. I let it ring once, then twice, then answered. Her voice was already high and unsteady before she finished her first sentence. She said I was tearing the family apart. She said my father would be heartbroken if he knew what I was doing. She said she had only ever tried to look after everyone. I listened without interrupting. I did not reveal what I knew. I did not offer reassurance. I did not comfort her the way I had done every single time she cried and called over the past 2 decades. When she finally stopped speaking, I told her calmly that she would need to speak with her attorney. I said I could not discuss the matter any further. Then I ended the call. My hands were completely still when I set the phone down. For the first time in my life, I did not run toward her pain. 2 days after my mother received a legal notice, Amy's mother appeared at our front door without any warning. I opened the door and found her standing there with anger already written across her entire face. Her handbag gripped against her side like she had come prepared for a fight. She pushed inside before I could say a word. She said I had no right to do what I was doing. She called an attack on a grieving widow. She said my mother had given everything to her family, and this was how I chose to repay her. She said some things about my character that were not worth repeating. She threatened to turn Amy permanently against me. I stood near the doorway and let her speak without interruption. I waited until she stopped to breathe, and then I spoke quietly. I told her I had certified copies of every document involved in the case. I told her the legal process was already in motion and had been for some time. I told her that nothing said in my living room was going to slow any of it down. Then I told her, politely and firmly, that I needed her to leave. She stared at me for a long moment. I had become someone she did not recognize. Maybe that was fair. I felt like someone knew myself. The confrontation with Amy's mother seemed to shake something loose inside Amy. That evening, after her mother drove away, Amy sat down across from me at the kitchen table and told me the truth. Part of it, at least. She admitted she had known the trust existed. She said she had known for years. She explained that my mother had brought her into situations slowly, asking small favors first, explaining things piece by piece. She said she had always been told that I would receive everything eventually, once things were properly sorted. She had believed that. She said she had never thought it would drag on this long. I listened to all of it without moving. Then I asked her a single question. I asked whether, during those years, any of the estate funds had touched our life in any way. Had the money benefited her, or us at any point? She looked down at the table. That silence was the only answer I needed. She had not been trapped or confused. She had been a willing participant. She had signed her name to those amendment pages with full awareness of what they were. She had watched me scrimp and work and sacrifice, and she had stayed quiet. She had benefited, and she had chosen silence. My mother's attorney reached out to Paula 3 days after the probate motion was filed. The message was carefully worded in the polite, measured language of people who are frightened but do not want to show it. They proposed private mediation. It would be better for everyone, they said. Quieter, more controlled, a way to reach a fair resolution without a lengthy court process. Paula laid out both options for me clearly. We could decline mediation and continue building our case toward a full hearing, or we could agree to attend, with a firm understanding that we were not bound to accept any settlement. I told her I wanted to go, not because I was softening my position, not because a settlement was on the table. I agreed to mediation for one reason. I wanted to sit across from my mother in a formal setting and watch what happened when the full weight of what we had uncovered landed on her in real time. People under genuine pressure reveal things. They say words they have not planned to say. They reach for old explanations that no longer hold up under scrutiny, and those words become part of an official record. I had a feeling she would give us something. I just needed her in the room. The mediation session took place in a neutral office with a long table and beige walls. My mother sat directly across from me for the first time since the legal process had started. She looked tired beneath her composed expression. Her attorney sat beside her, organized and professional. Her attorney opened by framing everything as a misunderstanding. Estate management was complicated, he said. Decisions had been made with good intentions over many years. The language he used was soft and passive throughout. Then the mediator turned to my mother and asked her to explain, in her own words, the decision she had made as executor of the estate. She spoke carefully for a few minutes. Then she paused. Something shifted in her. Perhaps the room felt safe enough that she let her guard down slightly. Perhaps the emotion of being there, across from me, loosened something she had meant to keep locked away. She said words she had not planned to say. His father trusted me to make the right decision. Paula's pen stopped moving. She wrote those exact words on a notepad and drew a slow, deliberate line beneath them. That statement was a confession disguised as a defense. The trust had not given my mother the authority to decide anything beyond what was written in it. Control had never been hers to claim. The mediator moved on. The damage was already done. Walter delivered his complete forensic report 2 weeks after the mediation session. It was 43 pages long, organized with tabs and timelines stretching back 20 years. Paula and I went through it section by section at her conference table. The findings were devastating. The childhood home had been sold at 41% below its documented fair market value. The company's shares had been transferred without proper legal authorization. The estate accounts had been drawn down through a series of transfers that had no supporting paperwork attached to them. The trust assets used as loan collateral had generated interest income over the years that was never returned to the estate. When Walter totaled all of it, the lost property value, the unauthorized transfers, the company appreciation over 20 years, the missing interest, the number was enormous. It was a figure my mother would have genuine difficulty repaying based on her current financial position. Walter set the final page in front of me and pointed to the summary line at the bottom. "She could owe more than she has left," he said quietly. I sat with that for a long time. 20 years of quiet, structured deception. 20 years of overtime shifts and careful budgeting on my end, while this money grew elsewhere. Paula was already drafting the next filing. Amy found out about the forensic report before I told her. I was not certain how. Most likely through her mother, who had managed to stay informed on every development so far. What I did know was that Amy came home one evening looking pale, and she spent most of dinner staring at her plate. Later that night, she sat on the edge of our bed and said she needed to talk. She told me she had spoken to a financial advisor on her own. She had been looking into what a court ruling of executor misconduct would mean for assets that had moved through connected accounts over the years. Assets that had, at various points, touched our joint savings in our home. Then she asked me directly. She asked if there was any way I could make it stop. She did not dress the request up or approach it indirectly. She looked at me and asked me to end the legal process. I looked back at her. I thought about every morning I had gotten up before sunrise to go to work. Every year I had told myself we were building something honest together. Every time she had known the truth and said nothing while I worked and struggled beside her. I told her no. She started to cry. Real, frightened tears. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. Word travels through a community in quiet, almost invisible ways. A cousin hears something and mentions it to an aunt. A neighbor notices that calls have stopped coming. A longtime friend senses that something is different and starts asking around. It does not take long for a carefully managed reputation to develop its first visible cracks. My mother had spent 2 decades curating her image in that community. She was a devoted widow, the selfless mother who had carried everything alone after a sudden loss. People admired her. They spoke well of her at community events. They checked in on her and praised her strength. Now things were shifting. Extended family members were reaching out to me quietly. Not all of them, but enough. Some had heard pieces of what was happening and had questions. Others had started doing their own silent math, remembering things my mother had said over the years that no longer lined up cleanly. Her social world began to feel the change. Conversations at community events grew shorter. Certain invitations stopped arriving. Cousins who had always called regularly were less present. She had spent 20 years building her life on carefully managed appearances and the goodwill of people who trusted what she showed them. Walter had spent 2 weeks starting to dismantle all of it. Paula received a call from the legal team representing my father's old manufacturing company. The board of directors had become aware of the probate challenge through their own legal counsel and had been monitoring the situation quietly. When the case went on record and the full scope of the alleged misconduct became clear, they had no choice but to respond. They launched an internal review of the historical share transfers. They were examining how my shares had moved out of my name and into the family holding account. They were reviewing authorization documents, checking signatures and dates, and running their own analysis of the paper trail. Paul explained what a positive outcome would mean in practical terms. If the probate court invalidated the original share transfers, as the evidence strongly suggested it would, my shares would revert to me automatically. My father had structured the original trust so that I held a controlling interest in the company. If everything was reversed, I would become the majority shareholder almost overnight. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about the employees who had worked in that building for years. I thought about what my father had built with his own hands. I thought about walking through those doors as the rightful owner, not as revenge. Just as truth finally landing where it always belonged. My mother called again, but this time she was not crying. She had clearly spoken at length with her attorney and arrived at a new approach. Her voice was measured and composed when she spoke. She offered a settlement. She said she acknowledged that errors had been made and that she was willing to arrange partial repayment of certain funds in exchange for the legal challenge being withdrawn. She said she was thinking about what remained of the family. She said my father would have valued peace above all else. I listened to the entire offer before I responded. Then I told her no. I was not refusing out of anger or a desire to cause her pain. I said no, because my father had once sat down with an attorney and a blank page and carefully written out exactly what he wanted to happen when he was no longer here. He had thought about his business, his property, and his son. He had built a legal document around that intention with great care. That document had been altered, rerouted, and hidden behind a vent in a wall. My mother did not get to redefine his intentions now, because a court ruling was closing in. His trust said what it said. My only job was to honor it. The court hearing was scheduled on a Tuesday morning. I arrived early. Paula and Walter were already seated at our table, everything arranged in careful order. Across the room, my mother sat beside her attorney. She did not look at me when I walked in. The judge was a composed woman who reviewed the filings in silence before inviting Paula to present the evidence. Paula walked through everything in chronological order. The original trust, my father's documented intentions, the amendment pages inserted years after his death, signed without proper authorization, the childhood home sold far below market value to a shell company, the bank transfers that came immediately after probate closed, the personal loan collateralized with state assets, the company's share transfers. Walter took the stand and presented his forensic findings in precise, steady language. He did not editorialize. He laid out numbers, dates, and documented paper trails with quiet accuracy. My mother's attorney raised objections at several points. But for every challenge, Paula had a certified document in response. Every claim had a paper trail behind it. By the time the session wound toward its close, I could see that the judge had stopped asking questions and started making notes. Across the room, my mother sat very still. Her composure had finally broken. She looked like someone who had just understood, for the first time, that it was over. The ruling came 11 days later. Paula called me the moment the decision arrived and read the key sections aloud over the phone. I sat in my car outside a grocery store and listened without moving. The judge found that executor misconduct had occurred. The evidence was documented, consistent, and convincing. The amendments made to the original trust were declared invalid. All asset transfers made during the period of misconduct were voided entirely. The trust reverted to its original structure, with me as the sole beneficiary, exactly as my father had intended 23 years earlier. Personal financial liability was imposed on my mother for every loss generated under her control. That included the undervalued property sale, the unauthorized bank transfers, the personal loan collateral, and the company share redirections. The total figure was substantial. It exceeded most of what she currently had to her name. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after the call ended. I had expected to feel triumph. What I actually felt was quieter than that. Something more like relief, and beneath it, something that surprised me, a deep, steady sadness. My father had planned carefully for me. He had written his intentions into a legal document because he wanted to protect me. The court had just confirmed that he had been right to try. I filed for divorce from Amy 3 weeks after the ruling came through. My attorney handled all the paperwork. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument, no moment of shouting or breaking things. I simply moved through the legal process with the same quiet, methodical focus I had applied to everything over the past several months. Amy had not been naive. She had not been manipulated into something she did not understand. She was an intelligent adult who had made a deliberate choice. She had put her own signature on those amendment pages with full understanding of what they meant. She had watched me work overtime and tighten every budget and build a life under the false belief that there was nothing else available to us. And she had said nothing. For years, I had loved her, genuinely and for a long time. But love alone cannot hold two people together when the foundation beneath them was built on a secret that deep. The woman who had sat across from me at that dinner table while her mother questioned my worth. The woman who had witnessed my inheritance redirected and signed her name to make it happen could not also be the woman who shared my future. There was no bitterness in the decision. Just clarity. I filed the papers on a Monday morning. Then I went to work. My first board meeting as majority shareholder was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon in early spring. Paula drove over with me. We pulled into the lot of low, wide building on the east side of the city, the same building my father had walked into every working day for 20 years. Some of the employees who had been there the longest came out to lobby when word spread that I had arrived. A few of them had known my father personally. One man, a senior technician named Frank who had been with the company since its earliest years, shook my hand with both of his and held on for a moment. He told me my father had spoken about me often. He said he was glad I was finally there. I stood in that lobby and felt something I had not fully prepared for. A quiet, settled sense of belonging. Not the kind of pride built from proving myself to people who doubted me. Something warmer than that. Something that felt more like coming home. The board meeting was formal and thorough. I asked careful questions. I listened more than I spoke. I reviewed the operational reports Walter had already walked me through. I was not there to dismantle anything my father had built. I was there to strengthen every part of it. Months after the ruling, my mother sent a short message asking if we could meet, not to appeal the judgment or propose another arrangement, just to talk. I agreed. We met at a small cafe near the old neighborhood. I arrived first. She came in a few minutes later, wearing a dark coat. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not older so much as diminished, as though something that had been holding her upright for years was finally gone. We ordered coffee. She wrapped both hands around the cup. She did not try to reframe anything. She sat quietly for a moment, and then she said she had spent all those years telling herself she was protecting things, making decisions my father was no longer alive to make, maintaining control over a situation that frightened her. I let her finish. Then I said the words I had needed to say for a long time. You didn't protect me, I told her quietly. You controlled me. She looked at the table. She did not argue. Before I left, the cafe manager brought out a small box, part of the state inventory, returned to the legal process. Inside was my father's original watch, the one he wore every single day. I fastened it on my wrist and walked outside. I had not screamed. I had not manipulated anyone or broken a single rule. I had simply told the truth, and the truth had corrected everything. That is the kind of justice that lasts.